We're going to do a quick little summary and analysis for chapter 4 to 7 of Life of Pi. And I'm just going to run through it with you quickly. Once again, I'll link Micah Reads. He reads the chapters so that you don't have to in the description. And that way you can sort of not have to read if you don't want to. And then you can have sort of summed up notes and then the little parts that you should remember. Okay, starting with chapter 4, Pi talks about how the Republic of India became bigger and that sort of branched out into Pondicherry where he lives, and how they started a zoo there, how that little piece of land area became a zoo. And then he basically talks a little bit about the zoo, and he talks about how there was a big train set, but or like there was a train, the zoo was so big that it needed a train, and then he says, but as I got older, the train got smaller, and now it's so small that it fits in my head, which is a very important sentence for you to remember. And once again, you'll see why later on. So just underline it or whatever. And then he talks about the zoo animals, and he kind of says like they're hidden, but the more you look, the more you see. And that basically is another important sentence because as you read on in the book, you'll see how that sentence helps Pi survive his situation. And then he talks about how his dad used to be a zoo or a hotel keeper, and then he became zookeeper, and how some people would say that, oh, it's pretty similar, but Pi argues that it's actually not, because with a hotel, your guests leave, whereas with a zoo, the guests never leave. They are permanent, and they are rowdy, they're noisy, that type of thing. And then he also describes the zoo as paradise on earth. So that's another important thing you can remember. And then he talks about like how a lot of people believe that religion is a lot of nonsense, and how people will also believe nonsense that animals can't be free if they live in the zoo. And then he talks about animals being wild and free, and basically he just says, they're free because they have shelter and they don't have to worry about finding food or like basically survival. They don't have to worry about getting sick, because if they get sick, the zookeepers call in a vet. And he just talks about how they freer in the zoo because they have nothing to worry about. And then he talks about in the wild how fear is high and supply of food is low. And then he goes on to talk about how animals have a routine and they kind of like being where they are. They don't like moving, and you see that in the wild. They'll sort of stay in one area. And then he talks about humans. He says, if someone had to come to us and say, all right, get out your house, I've opened the door for you, you're free, we're not going to be too happy about that, because now this is our home. So he says that, and then he says that animals are actually happy where they are, because there was a chimpanzee once with a cage that was open, and the chimpanzee was slamming the gate shut because he was disturbed now that his area wasn't the same anymore, and he wanted the gate of his enclosure to be closed. So he just talks about little stories about that. And then chapter 5, he basically just talks about his name, and he's had a lot of problems with his name because his name is Piscine, and people called him Pissing, and it wasn't his like favorite thing, as you can imagine. So he said that he was so worried once while ordering pizza in Canada that when they asked what his name is, he said Ian Julian, and then they said the pizza delivery came for I am who I am. And that's also something that you should remember. And then he says, it is true that those we meet can change us, sometimes so profoundly that we are not the same afterwards, even onto our names. So he's basically saying that sometimes things happen that we are not the same, even onto our names. So like our names can mean a totally different thing. And then he says how he went to school and he taught, so he went to school obviously in one school and they called him Pissing, and then he went to a new school and he didn't want to get called Pissing anymore, so he called himself Pi, and he went through this whole thing of explaining like pi, the little pi sign, 3.14, that type of thing. And he repeated the stunt with every teacher that he went to. So kids started calling him Pi instead of pissing or anything else. And then he says that repeating the stunts is important in teaching or like teaching something to someone. And he says not only with animals but with humans as well. But one thing you must remember is that repetition with animals trains them. So like if you take a dog and you teach him to sit and you teach him to sit and you do it over and over again, eventually the dog will start sitting, but you have to start with repetition. Then in chapter 6, it's once again the author talking about Pi, and he just talks about how Pi is a really good cook, how he can make wonderful like curry dishes, and then he says that he's also pretty good at making a Western dish. And then he says that he notices that the cupboard behind Pi is full of food. It's jam-packed, and how like he actually can't believe how full it is. He says like it could feed a starving nation, something along those lines. And then chapter 7 talks about Satish Kumar. That's an important name to remember, and the reason why is because there are 2 Satish Kumars in the book. So that's something you have to remember because it is a symbol. And then he says that this teacher, Satish Kumar, is the reason why he studied zoology, and this Satish Kumar is an atheist. And Pi talks about how he kind of realized that he didn't really have a problem with atheists, because now you must remember Pi is quite a religious boy, but he had more of a problem with agnostics, which are people who don't know whether they believe or not. And he was saying, because it's fine to be unsure for a while, but if you're going to stay unsure for the rest of your life, it's like choosing immobility as a means of transport. So it's basically saying like, it's not going to get you anywhere. Rather make a decision than be indecisive. And that's all I'm going to do for you today. But those are the most important things you need to remember from those chapters. And that's all. Thank you.